Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. To any new listeners, welcome. Glad to have you here with us. This is our weekly historic podcast, Forgotten History, and we have a special guest here. I know you guys have been looking forward to this, so without further ado, we have our author, Amanda Camporiali. She's here to talk to us about her new book called The History of Japanese Feminism. This book is about the Japanese feminist movement starting in the 1910s. She features prominent feminists and how they found their voices in order to allow the Japanese society to change. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Amanda.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So tell us, Amanda, what was your inspiration for this latest book?
Well, I was at a loss as to what to write about next, so I figured I'd do some random Google searches to find another interesting topic. I've always found anything to do with religion, society, and women super interesting, but as you can probably tell, I've stuck with mostly the European side of the world in my previous works, so I definitely wanted some kind of a change. And I came across the name Hiratsuka Rachio, and when I started to read about her, I was just so impressed that I decided that I wanted to look into Japanese feminist history. From there, I had to pick a time period, and at that point, I knew it needed to be a small window of time because it was originally supposed to be another journal article, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to address Hiratsuka Rachio's time period specifically, which was the early 1900s, or if I wanted to look at a larger period of time. Ultimately, I just was finding so much information that I went with the larger time period of the 1910s to around the 1930s. I have a couple of events that happened in the early 1940s.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you don't just have a list of what you want to research or write about, or was there anything that influenced you to pick this topic, or did you just wing it?
I mean, anything I do, I tend to wing it at first, at least until I bang out what my plans are. But no, I don't typically use lists until I'm well into the project.
That gives me, and I'm sure plenty of other aspiring writers out here, some hope. Now, to get started, we've had some of our audience send in some questions, and some that are still popping up on my computer here that I'd like to ask. We'll go back and forth between questions from our audience as they pop up and myself, if that works for you.
No, not at all. Hit me with them. I love answering questions.
So our first question comes from Cassidy in Maryland. She wants to know, what methods did you use to analyze the political cartoons and images that you used in your book?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I actually used roughly the same method for both. I took into account how the public would have viewed and reacted to the images, and this helped me understand how and why they were published. I also made sure I looked at every bit of the image. You never know what you can find in the backgrounds of pieces. The images in the magazines were important, and especially in the case of the Blue Stockings magazines or Cedo, because it was such a controversial magazine that anything published there was important, as it was viewed as practically groundbreaking. That one in particular was one of the best examples of really progressive feminist stuff. Some of the women who were educated in the 1912 to the 1926 time period started this magazine in 1911. The women wrote, discussed, and published feminist thoughts and questions from Japan and abroad. The magazine images and any other images in my book are there because they demonstrate what society was like and how the women at Blue Stocking and other women were discussing their society and how they tried to change the very world where they lived in for the better. These images, including the ones about the modern girls, offer a look at how the culture of Japan was changing.
That brings me to a question that I have. Were there any images in particular that were your favorite or have any specific significance to you or your work?
Yeah, so there was a series of images attached to the idea of the modern girl in Japan. It wasn't a specific image or images, but it was the idea surrounding them and their conception that makes them my favorite. In Japan, the media created this modern girl to showcase the new class of working women in their many new jobs. And these jobs ranged from gasoline girls, shop window mannequins, even bus conductors they required women to dress in new styles coming in from the West. Once women and men in Japan started to dress more Western, the images about women's bodies started to show anxieties about how the West was affecting Japan in terms of clothes and other non-Japanese ways. And these people were acting differently in the workplace and later on in the domestic sphere. So the images of the female body, and again, these images ranged from women as train conductors or any of the other jobs that I mentioned, even images of naked women, they became a symbol of a perceived threat to social stability. There was also another image from a feminist journal called Funjin Undo, and this journal was it wasn't a leftist journal, and it was able to get away with featuring more images of Japanese people, women in particular. And they were able to do so because state censorship was big at this time, and because they were leftist, they didn't have as many rules to follow. And in this journal, women were viewed as strong, amazing, and capable people who worked together to get what they wanted. And they're viewed this way because the women in the picture show the jobs that women worked and how they worked together. In most images, you can see them physically reaching out or learning together to each other and other women. And this is shown for women in factories, on farms. That's in a range of settings. So the particular image that this is one of my favorites, so we're going to talk about it. It's called Work Together in the Women's Movement by Shimizu Keijiro, and she was one of the many people involved with the journal. It was published in 1928, and it was the first edition of the sixth volume. And the image depicts a woman working on a carving of a large statue of a woman facing away from the audience and reaching and looking for the sky. So one might even say when they're looking at the image that the woman is looking towards the future and what the women are trying to build. The statue itself looks very strong and feminine, and the image symbolizes women's aim to reach and build the future they wanted, filled with the freedom, equality, and liberty. It symbolizes this kind of unity because feminists at the time were calling out to all women to band together, no matter their social status, their job, or even gender or their opinions, to make the change that they wanted on platforms like magazines and other publications.
That image sounds lovely and definitely would be considered progress. What was something that really struck you as an important first step by women in Japan to really open the doors to progressive conversation?
Well, there was a lot. I mean, for one, the Japan Women's University was founded in 1901 by a man who was a proponent of equal education for men and women, and his name was Jinzo Naruse. He wanted to help educate women and free them from a society in which women were forced into certain roles, particularly gender roles, and wanted to help them gain independence from society and gain pride in themselves as Japanese citizens. This university educated hundreds of women, and some of them even went on to fight for equality by publishing articles, writing books, and participating in organizations focused on changing laws in favor of women. For example, an organization was the Women's Suffrage League, or the WSL, and one of the most notable women was the one that I was mentioning before, Hiratsuka Reichio. She graduated from the university, and she went on to do so many things. Secondly, Japan was one of the countries in which enfranchisement for women wouldn't be until 1946. But there was this ideal of a good wife, wise mother that was in the education programs for women. And that ideal originated in the 1890s. And by 1912 to 1926, the education programs were changing and starting to phase this out. So that generation of women were higher educated than ever before, and they were actually starting to become self-aware and address themselves in new forms of self-expression. Blue Stockings is, again, one of the best examples of changing self-expression because of what they were writing. They even addressed a play, which I also analyze in my book, called The Dollhouse by Henrik Ibsenson. And this magazine was so influential because it did something that was never done before by women in Japan and a lot abroad. Women weren't really publishing magazines for women made by women. So Blue Stockings questioned what was going on in the world, recognized gender roles, and published their questions and responses, which was new, again.
Vanessa would like to know more about the section of your book dealing with the play called A Dollhouse. I know you mentioned it before, but could you just elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, of course. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the book because I fell in love with the play and the open-endedness of it. So the play itself premiered in September 1911 and was written by Henrik Ibsenson. The main character was a woman named Nora, and she was the wife and mother of 3 children. Some say she made a mistake at the start of her marriage by borrowing a large loan of money in order to save her husband, who is ill, so that they can travel and go to a warmer climate. However, as per a drama, her secret was threatened to be given away, and we see Nora doing everything possible to save her marriage, but to no avail. And Nora starts to prepare to leave as a disgraced wife and mother. But in the end, it all works out, and Nora doesn't like it. She doesn't like how things are so easily fixed, and realizes that she's trapped in a dollhouse, literally and figuratively. So the play ends with Nora slamming the door of her home behind her to learn more about herself and the world before she can go back to being a wife and a mother again. So it's this open-endedness that allows everyone to project their thoughts and feelings onto Nora and cause such controversy. I say project because the women that analyzed this play took their own circumstances into account when they were writing or talking about it. and they physically addressed Nora, and that came to symbolize the women themselves. It allowed educated women to see where and how they themselves, in some cases, were trapped in their own dollhouses. So I hope that answers most questions.
Next up, we have a question from Zaina. Her question is, what did the feminists do or think in reaction to the play?
Oh, yeah. Like I said before, the reactions really depended on the feminist and her situation. For example, and I talk more about her in my book, but again, Hira Tasuka Reichiu was super, super critical about Nora. Her main issues with Nora seem to be that Nora's impulsiveness to leave home without really thinking about it, or anything, really. Hira Tasuka Reichiu even wrote to Nora directly in her magazine in the form of letters and was very unsympathetic to her plight. Another example would be from another feminist named Kato Midori, and she thought Nora's personality was simply a mask worn by Nora to appease social norms in her husband. This allowed her to see the ending of the play as a complete unveiling of Nora's true personality and allowed people to see the inside of the exterior of a person. So this true personality was thought to be hidden in all women and could only be seen when a woman wanted to or was allowed to show her true self. This is part of the idea that women needed to fit the role that was most pleasing to a superior person, especially in terms of husband and wife. And this was a practice called kawa igaru.
On that note, let's talk about the 1919 International Labor Conference. You made this out to be monumental in your book. Could you say a few things about it?
Yeah, so it all comes down to Tanaka Taka, who was, I know her name is awesome, who was a feminist and a professor of social work at the Japan Women's University. She was also the grandniece of the capitalist Shibu Suwasa Ikichi. Tanaka also earned a BA in English from Stanford University in 1917 and an MA in sociology from the University of Chicago. What's fascinating was her MA thesis because it was about a social psychological analysis of the forces subordinating Japanese women, including the late Meiji norms of female self-sacrifice, reticence, and obedience. And this shows that she was educated in the U.S. and compared it with Japanese society and the subordination of women during her life. And this is why she was instrumental in the 1919 at the conference. She, by all accounts, was going to follow the script that was given to her by Kamada Ikichi, who was the president of the Keio University and a member of the House of Peers. Taka was at the ILO, which stands for International Labor Conference, to be Kamada's advisor, as he was also Japan's chief government delegate. Both he and Muto Sanjay, the managing director of Kanegafuchi Spinning Company, preached good relations between their workers and employers and stated that women workers wanted to work at night. The script listed the reason why Japanese workers could and should work during the night in the textile industry, but in the middle of her speech, she pulled out her own notes and completely broke ranks to advocate for free speech and economic rights in the workplace for both men and women. This disobedience, I feel, stemmed not only from a desire to do what's right, but by her education. Her education gave her the tools to stand up for what's right and what was truly needed at the time. And she knew she was able to recognize what was wrong and why what the men were saying was wrong at the conference. And she was also educated in America, which gave her so much experience with the suffrage movement over there. And what's also really cool about her is that Tanaka was the only female delegate in a 60-person delegation. In the end, after she rapid-fired started her speech, she and Muto got into an argument at that meeting it was for the Commission on Women's Employment on November 8th is when they got into the argument when she switched her speeches. And the issue that they were talking about was whether night work should be delayed or kept as it was or just gotten rid of in general. And she just talked about the incredibly tough working conditions for female workers and how they were dying young because of the night work. I mean, the conditions were they were unsanitary, they were harsh, they were long. I mean, they didn't really get any breaks, and she was just intent on calling for an immediate ban on night work. And the rest of the Japanese delegation were absolutely stumped. They never expected this to happen and reacted almost violently as soon as they realized that she was not saying what they had told her to say. Muto had the worst reaction. He tried to get her testimony stopped and revoked, but was unable to. And his was most likely the most violent because her speech directly challenged what he had stated was going on with the night workers. He even called for a psychological evaluation because Taka had been pregnant at the time, and he claimed that she had shamed Japan because she was a woman speaking out of turn and questioned her love for Japan. This moment is so important because as much as it was a conflict in Japanese society, it was also a conflict between Japan and other nations. This time period was really turbulent because so much was changing, and there were so many power plays happening all around. Japan, who was among the nations, were fighting for land and power, and they were also in a battle to prove they were just as strong and as powerful and should be recognized just as much as the Western nations. And by Western nations, I mean France, Great Britain, and the U.S. So the moment when she put down the other note cards, and picked up her own, what in my mind was a turning point. She was instrumental in helping women gain the start they needed in 1919 to work towards change. She did get Japan to compromise on gradually ending night work at the ILO, and it really shows a ton of commitment from women to get what they wanted and that they were willing to fight for it, especially when you add in the higher education that women were receiving at the time, and all the influences from the West, so to speak. And all these different factors help women gain the tools and influence their voices to start to question Japanese society.
All right, so did Muto ever retract his inquiry to Tanaka Taka's mental state, or did she have to submit to some kind of exam?
Well, Taka was actually kicked off the committee she was on because she fainted at the next meeting. Taka claimed that the excuse that was given to her was that she was pregnant, and she asked Mary Anderson while in the U.S., who was the first director of the U.S. Women's Bureau, to ask the Japanese delegation to reinstate her and try to get the Japanese public and government to see that a woman being pregnant did not affect an American woman and should have no effect on a Japanese woman's status. She didn't have to submit to any exam because she was no longer in the delegation. However, Muto actually did retract his statement due to pressure from the public and government. His outburst got him into quite a bit of trouble, as he was then accused of being unable to control himself and had looked foolish in front of the other nations.
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, one of our listeners actually left a lengthy comment about a shift in behavior. Let me see if I can find it, and maybe you can enlighten us here. Here it is. Okay, so this is from Eric, and he says that there was a shift in marital practice during this time as well.
Yeah, that's almost spot on. It's in what's called the Taisho period, which was around the 1912 to 1926, when women were getting higher education. And there was a shift in the way marriage, sex, and love were viewed. This shift was just starting in the public sphere, but it was very, very slowly spreading to the domestic sphere where the majority of women were. At the time, there were about 3% of marriages were by choice, and I think about 38 were what's called mai, or arranged marriages, and I think they were about 40% still at the time were blind marriages. And that means that men, while married, were still finding entertainment outside of marriage. I mean, the statistics on prostitution at the time only continued to rise, just in a different way after the change in view. It went from geisha to jokyu, which were just waitresses. And for the most part, it all depended on class and how wealthy a man was. If he was able to, some even had a second wife in the Meijing era, which was the one before the Taisho era. And this is why the geisha played an important role insofar as they were, for lack of a better word, the enemies of the new modern housewife or the modern girl, because the new women wanted to have a marriage akin to what we have now in the States. And after the shift in thinking, and after World War I, there was an expansion of the mass consumer culture that further commoditized female sexuality, which goes back to the idea of the modern girl again, and stress about how Japanese culture was changing. There was also an increase in women's magazines in terms of women being consumers and having a bit more freedom to consume, so to speak. Magazines allowed new ideas, like in the blue stocking era, to normalize new ideas coming in from around the world. These new ideas, including the fact that an unhappy home life was what pushed men to stray from their wives.
Right, okay. This question comes from Sophie in Massachusetts, and she wants to know how Akiko was involved in the scandal.
Oh, yeah. So, Yaganahara Akiko, who is also known as Bukarin or Yanaso, was a famous Japanese poet who was married and had a young lover with whom she ran away. They did this in 1921, and she actually published a letter to her husband in a nationally read newspaper. And in the letter, she claimed that she ran away because their marriage was a loveless one. And she tried to be understanding and build true love, but failed due to her husband's many lovers. One can only imagine how the husband reacted to that letter. And this scandal, as it was known, was one of the many examples of why being in a love marriage was so important instead of a blind one, for example. And these circumstances allowed women to really take control of their sexuality and lives outside of their parents' home and gave them an option and an opinion in their lives in which many never had before.
Was there a downside to this change in thinking?
Absolutely. Women having a choice was a great thing, but adultery was still around. Men were still straying from their wives because it was still acceptable. There was even an image of a wife and a geisha pulling on the arms of a man in two separate directions, which really shows how serious the issue was if it was in a publication. And it wasn't until the late 1920s to early 1930s that a new concept to counteract men's adultery with geisha and other women was introduced. And that concept was eroticized femininity, which was all about being attractive to one's husband and women wanting to act the role of mistress. And this goes, again, back to the idea of being a modern girl.
So let me interrupt you for a hot second. We have another question from a New York man named Josh. I believe, if I'm reading his question right, that there was a magazine named Shufu no Tomo where they published an article called 100 Secret Ways to Control Your Husband in September 1925. You're nodding, so I guess he's right. He wants to know more information on that if you have it.
That was definitely published, and it was one of pieces of advice given to be a beautiful wife. That actually reminds me of a panel discussion that took place in September 1932, and it was essentially about a woman stating that she wanted to be everything to her husband, mother, sister, friend, mistress, wife, all at the same time. And after the changing thinking, there was even more magazines supporting things like what the woman was saying. But at the end of the day, even though women were still making choices to, quote-unquote, control their husbands, I still have to point out that they were still trying to please their husbands. And this means that even though they were very progressive and stuff was in the media and accepted there, it didn't mean that it was happening at the ground level. It was sort of a trickle-down effect where it started with the magazines and other publications, and gradually people started accepting it and practicing it. Japanese women still had a way to go before things completely changed. It's the fact that these women were in the media at all is what's important. These magazines, political cartoons, and publications by women on different subjects is what influenced most women to begin fighting for change.
Did the Shufu no Tomo magazine address anything else that would have been relevant to changing women's lifestyles?
Certainly. There was an article on 4 points to curb a husband's bad actions, and they were beauty, sophistication, demeanor, and sex. For one, beauty, one should try to look as young and beautiful through cosmetics, hairstyle, fashion, and there were advertisements for tons of different kinds of cosmetics that were included in almost every issue of the Shufu no Tomo magazine. For sophistication, one should be able to keep a good conversation going between the wife and the husband, so the wife should always be learning and reading and being up to date on current events. There was actually an image of a woman sitting at a desk reading a book from August 1931. It was that issue of Shufu no Tomo, which showed how important it was to keep educating yourself in order to compete with the Jokyu. Because the Jokyu and the geisha were allowed to talk about anything and everything, and especially current affairs. For demeanor, one should be playful and cute, rather than reserved, proper, and serious, and these behaviors were supposed to inspire protectiveness in men and husbands. Then there's this concept of the kawaigaru, which we talked about earlier in the case of the play and true personalities. But again, it's the concept of an older or more powerful person taking care of a younger or less powerful person due to them having a relationship. There's also this idea of amaru, which details how a less powerful person depends on the powerful one to attend to their needs by acting weak and cute like a child. And these concepts about the relationships don't necessarily define romantic relationships, but it was the most common example. Then, of course, comes a section about sex, and there was two ways to view it. The first was that the wife was encouraged to say no to sex with her husband as little as possible. I can't even believe this, but there was even some doctors that told women to have sex with their husbands, even if there was bleeding, because bleeding was better than venereal disease from an affair. The second approach was called the reserving strategy, in which a wife would limit sex with her husband to the point that the husband would be dying to have sex with his wife. And this strategy was obviously at odds with the previous one, so I guess it depended on the husband. The main point of that article and the whole conversation that we're having here is to convey that magazines influenced a social change for women. Women were given a platform to use to influence other women and gave them a voice about their lives. They were able to talk about their issues as women and find ways to deal with them and get them published and out into the world. And it was those discussions that influenced changes to women's behavior, and then the behavior became normalized.
Where did these magazines come from?
Well, it was a really long and drawn-out process that happened over many years. If you look at certain platforms like magazines, one of the first was Blue Stockings, which ran from 1911 to 1916. So that was, and the reason why I go back to that one is because this was if not the first, it was one of the first magazines that was successfully published for women by women. And when the First World War ended and the Versailles Treaty was signed, there was a much bigger stage for actors and a much bigger competition for nations. And I kind of stated this in the beginning, but by this I mean that every person who is a representative of a nation is on a national stage in front of the whole world. They have more to win and more to lose in this bigger picture. Japan especially wanted to be seen as a global power and needed to fit in with the other world powers, like France, Britain, and even the United States. In order to do this, they needed to change. And one of the things they changed was relationships between nations. Once there was more information flowing in and out of Japan and products from other states, so did the issues and questions that came with them. For example, the play that we talked about earlier, A Dollhouse, was imported, and the issues and questions surrounding a woman's role in public and private spheres were imported. And this goes back to the woman question as well. And the women's question was about the debate on how these Japanese new women should act and function in a society on a national and international stage. So when you ask me about where Japan got the magazines, I can answer that the material came from a little bit of everywhere, even though they were published in Japan for Japanese citizens.
So how did feminists react to these changes or magazines?
It depended on the feminist. Some feminists, like Hira Tsuka Richiu, wanted to be progressive, and they were, with their magazines, they actually hated the Shofo no Tomo magazine. They thought it was worthless because it focused on women getting women to please their husbands in order to gain happiness and live a good life. In reality, they thought that Japanese women... In reality, it helped Japanese women gain control over their lives.
In your book, you also referenced a comic. Care to tell us about that?
Yeah, it actually goes along really well with what we just talked about. The comic is called Tokyo Puck, and the issue that I wrote about was on the dalliance in the Yoshiwara. And it predates what we just talked about, but it deals with the geisha and the women of blue stockings. One of the images that I find slightly funny is a black and white image of a geisha sitting in the tea house, leaning away from two women involved in blue stockings. The two women, a part of the magazine, had blue stocking written on their clothes, while the geisha was wearing a traditional kimono. The facial expressions on the women is what's funny. The geisha is leaning away and seems to have a surprised and very confused expression on her face, while the other two have inquisitive, almost arrogant or smug looks on their faces. And this image is meant to show the exact situation in 1912 when a small number of blue stocking women actually visited a tea house. This took the media by storm, and most people were either outraged or found the situation incredibly funny. And the comic allowed many to revisit social norms surrounding sex, gender, and class. It was also a reminder for women on both sides of their status and gender norms.
So my next question comes from Mark in Alaska. How were the blue stocking women viewed after this incident?
Well, they didn't have a good reputation to start with, and after this they had an even worse one. I mean, the situation was completely taken out of context, for one. The women had gone there to question the geisha, not gain pleasure at the tea house, and after the newspaper had been published, people actually threw rocks at the blue stocking home for about 3 days. The media, after the scandal broke, the cartoons were just filled with inconsistencies. Some said the blue stocking women were predatory, overly sexual, manly, or prudish, and others said they were just terrible people. It depended on the publication, but there was definitely interesting ways to view them.
Samantha from New York would like to know if the feminists also had stories about the geisha.
Oh, they so did. The blue stocking women were more curious than anything else about them. They also saw themselves as better than the geisha because of their higher education and intellectual mindset. The women also thought of the geisha as old world. because they had a link to the past that the Blue Stockings women didn't think the modern Japan needed.
On to the next question. We have Sarah and I who want to know who influenced other feminists by the name of Ichikawa Fusei.
Yeah, good pronunciation. She was named the Susan B. Anthony of Japan, apparently, by some Americans. She was a rights-based feminist who was involved in many organizations to champion women's rights. Ichikawa Fusei, like many other feminists, actually went to the States for education, and in Fusei's case, she met with American feminists like Jane Addams and Alice Paul in 1922, and that definitely cemented her ideas about civil rights as the way to equal rights.
What did she do next?
She helped organize the League of the Realization of Women's Suffrage, which was later shortened to Women's Suffrage League, or the YSL, in 1923. They also were able to get who they wanted into office in the election of 1928, and she campaigned for a lot of things within the YSL, like consumer activism, equal rights for men and women, and voting rights for women. Voting rights for women was pushed in 1930 and 1931, but ultimately failed, even with women being limited to voting at the municipal level only.
The next question we have is from Sophie in New Jersey, and she wants to know how women were given a voice after 1942.
That's a tricky question that I address in way more depth in my book. And the simple answer is that after 1942, if women wanted a voice, they had to have a position in the government. After 1942, there was no more self-governing women's organizations in Japan, and that's the sad part, because women at this time in government jobs were mostly ignored because men outnumbered them, and therefore their opinions were reduced to useless chatter and gossip.
Huh. Well, that being the case, when did women get the right to vote in Japan?
Women didn't get the right to vote until, I think, 1946, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, since we are running out of time, I want to direct you to another woman in your book. She was Yamakawa Kiku. Can you tell us about her?
Yeah, Yamakawa Kiku. So, bonus points for the pronunciation. She was a socialist who tried to work on gender roles and equality for all. She received her education at Women's English School, or as it's known today, Tsuda College, and started to write at the magazine called Shin Shisuki and at Seto. She did not like when workers, male or female, were taken advantage of, and so she drew attention to the issues and the divides in class and gender and in her articles and statements. My favorite thing about her is that she called for the abolition of the head of the household system and any laws that treated women as incompetent. And she did many other things, but those two are my favorite because those systems and laws held women back the most. Simply because if the law viewed a woman as incompetent, she had no say whatsoever. So, like the founder of Japan Women's University, she was a proponent of equality. Anyway, Yamaka Kiku took her platform very serious. She wrote plenty of books and journal articles advocating for what she thought was right. A common theme in her book was that politics, education, and economic ability would help raise women's place in society. She was also in charge of the Women's and Minors Bureau, or the WMB, as the bureau chief for about 5 years. And she used her authority to spread awareness about working conditions and wanting to improve them and help women gain a more active place in society through work. Of course, she ran into problems and was unable to do what she wanted because the WMB did not have the official authority to do so.
All right, then. On that sad note, you mentioned an incident called the Manchurian Incident. What is that, and how does it relate to your main point?
So the Manchurian Incident is actually where I end my book. It took place in 1931, and I cover the voting rights, but that's that's a tinier section. So September 1931, Japan's Kantō Army was stationed in Manchuria, and right-wing officers bombed a section of the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway to incite hostility. And this had a drastic effect on the YSL and what other feminists wanted to accomplish. From that point on, feminism was suspect because it had been introduced to Japan from the West, and they were not very trusting of the West or international nationalism at that point. Feminists had to change their tactics, and they couldn't introduce any new bills for about 10 years. After that, Ichikawa remained in the feminist sphere, and mostly the other feminists, they all remained in the feminist sphere. They participated in conferences, and ultimately, Ichikawa in particular tried to get the government to give women's rights by following what the American women had done after World War I.
As our time comes to a close, I have a very important question. What was your favorite part of the book?
That's a hard question. I love all parts of the book, but you're going to make me pick one, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Figures. I guess it would probably be the overall view of how things changed for women during the period of 1910 to about 1930, 1940. If you look at what they had before, it was the ideal of a good wife, wise mother, and then as higher education and the new consumer market filtered in for middle-class women, they turned into intellectuals. I mean, the courage it took for the women of Bluestocking is just incredible, or any other feminist at the time was just amazing. And then you see them along their journey, and even though the magazine that particular magazine, the Bluestocking one, didn't run until after 1916, we see the evolution of different ones and of educated women running the gauntlet between the geisha, the government, and so many other challenges. The women of that era were extraordinary, and the way they went about changing their world for the better was just awesome. So I guess the journey is my favorite part. The end is the best.
All right, and there you have it. Amanda, thank you so much for being here and answering all of our questions. Good luck to you in your next endeavor. That concludes our podcast for the day, so thank you so much for listening, and we hope you listen again. If you'd like to find out who will feature next, make sure you stay tuned in.